Hi there, it's Dr. Connolly. Welcome to Module 5. We're getting into the home stretch. 2/3 of the class is done and we're in our last 2 weeks. I hope you did well on the second exam. I'll have those grades done in a couple of days and I'll send out an announcement as soon as they're all done. Okay, we are moving into the last two modules of the class which are on historical and contemporary social change, with this module being historical social change. So the readings for this week are historical in nature. They're from basically the turn of the last century, what's often called the first wave of the women's movement. And I'll talk a little bit more about the 3 waves of feminism at the end of this podcast. But to give you an overview of how I'm going to suggest that you do this week's module is that you give yourself some extra time. The reading is less than in previous weeks, but it's historical in nature. And so the language is a bit unfamiliar. I love the language. The language from that period of time is pretty passionate. All right. And so you have both official documents, you have letters, you've got fiction, right, that is incredibly passionate about women's rights, about the relationships between men and women, about the relationships of individuals to the state, and I hope that you have a good time with it. But give yourself some time. If you typically read twice, know that you might want to be reading 3 times in order to kind of digest the material. You'll see, of course, that you have your third and final homework assignment that is due over the next 2 weeks. And what I'm going to suggest is that you do this homework assignment immediately. It is related to this module and only this module, not the following module. So go ahead and get that done. All right. And again, I think it's a fun homework assignment. It has you either write your own marriage contract, kind of using as the template that historical one, or it has you go into a website and add something from Wyoming. I was shocked to find out that they don't even have Nellie Ross in their website as a famous historical female figure that is important. All right. So I'm going to suggest that you kind of get your reading done, all right? Spend some extra time with it because it is language that is different than we're used to reading now, and do the homework assignment and get that thing uploaded. Then that will leave you next week to do the more kind of extensive reading and get ready for, believe it or not, the final exam. Okay, let me just briefly talk about the 3 waves of feminism that were discussed in some of the readings in the earlier parts of the course, as well as talked about a bit more extensively in some of these readings. It's typically referred to as 3 waves of feminism, and there's lots of contention about that, about whether or not there really are waves, and about where do you draw the lines between the first and the second and the second and the third. But just to give you the briefest of overviews. The first wave of feminism is acknowledged to be, both in the United States and around the globe, the suffrage movement. All right, and so we're talking about that period of time from about the mid 1800s up until suffrage. All right, and so when you think about that period of time in the United States, there are some other very, very important movements that are going on. First and foremost being the anti-slavery movement. Okay, and so you will find, for example, lots of women who were involved in the anti-slavery movement. You will find, however, that you will have women who make the argument that it should be women and not slaves. Right? It should be white women and not slaves who are next granted the right to vote. All right, so you've got some racism going on in the early women's movement. All right, as well as a joining with, all right, the anti-slavery movement, women being part of the Underground Railroad, learning from that initial civil rights movement, that, you know what, we all need to be fighting for our rights, slaves and women. All right, so the first wave of suffrage being kind of from kind of the mid 1800s, all right, up through again kind of the point of the passage in the United States of the 19th Amendment, all right, and granting the women's right to vote, and around the globe as well. All right, that's considered the first wave. All right, you see kind of comparable movements, but without slavery, for example, in France and England, etc. All right. Okay, so that's your first wave of the feminist movement. The second wave of the feminist movement is the one that we consider from the kind of the again following the civil rights movement in the United States of the 1960s to kind of the women's movement of the 1970s. All right. And so when you think about people taking to the streets, all right, for equal pay, for a women's right to choose, changes in language that led to kind of the use of Ms. rather than Miss and Mrs. All right, that's the second wave of the women's movement. The second wave of the women's movement was also fraught with both incredible excitement and incredible coming together as well as controversy. All right, the second wave of the women's movement was often considered a white women's movement. All right, not and making the argument, for example, that women's work in the home should be valued. Responding to kind of the 1950s, in some ways erroneous stereotype, but still the stereotype of women's jobs as being in the home with kids. Well, the reality is the overwhelming majority of women of color, as well as working class women in the United States, worked for wages outside of the home. But the women's movement was kind of portraying women's work as solely being in the home, which it certainly wasn't. All right, it certainly wasn't. But the second wave of, of the women's movement was what we think about when we think about kind of the fervor over women's rights, all right, however broadly defined, and all of the issues that we think of being associated with the women's movement are come about in this kind of late 1960s up through the late 70s, early 80s. All right. And again, lots of controversy. It's where, for example, Kimberly Crenshaw, all right, came up with her notion about intersectionality. It's like, hang on, hang on. We need to consider, right, not simply the experiences of white women, but we need to kind of first think about a standpoint epistemology that we've talked about extensively already, and then to think about intersectionality as important. It's not simply the category of woman. Okay? All right, so second wave movement. All right, second wave movement. Third wave, all right, we are in what is called the third wave of the women's movement. And oh my goodness, all right, we've got a lot that goes on here. And again, this is one that is, they're not simple. All right, you can always say like the first wave was about suffrage, the second wave was about equal rights, the third wave as be your own person. All right, the third wave of the women's movement takes into account first that intersectionality, all right, that recognition of the importance of other characteristics, race, class, sexuality, all right, and doesn't necessarily privilege one over the other. It's one that looks to kind of individuals' choices, all right, and fluidity of those choices. It's where we get kind of our postmodern theorizing, our queer theorizing, where our center of analysis is no longer, for example, the category of woman, all right, but the category of, for example, normativity. All right. What is it that we are privileging? And we theorize what we're privileging, all right, as opposed to the difference. All right. So we think about heteronormativity, or we kind of think about male privilege, like we saw with Peggy McIntosh. That's what get theorized a bit in this third wave of the women's movement. All right. Or feminism is a better way to put it. All right. All right. So first wave, second wave, third wave. All right. Your readings for this module are from that first wave. I hope you have a good time with them, and I wish you a very good week. Bye bye.